The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Phoenix as Detective Marcus Rodriguez sipped his coffee outside the precinct, unaware that this would be the last normal moment of his life. The radio crackled with what seemed like routine calls: a disturbance at Phoenix General Hospital, reports of aggressive patients attacking staff. Marcus dismissed it as another drug-related incident until his partner, Officer Jessica Thompson, burst through the station doors with a look of pure terror etched across her face. She had just returned from the hospital, her uniform torn and stained with something dark that definitely wasn't coffee. "Marcus, we need to evacuate the city," she whispered, her voice trembling. Those weren't patients, they were something else entirely. Before Marcus could respond, the emergency broadcast system shrieked across every radio, television, and phone in the city: "This is not a drill. Seek immediate shelter. Avoid all contact with infected individuals. Do not attempt rescue operations." The words sent chills down Marcus's spine, but it was the chaos erupting in the streets that truly made his blood run cold. Within minutes, Phoenix transformed from a bustling metropolis into a nightmare landscape. Marcus watched through the precinct windows as ordinary citizens began attacking each other with savage, inhuman brutality. A businessman in a crisp suit tackled a jogger, tearing into his throat with teeth that seemed too sharp, too eager. The jogger's screams echoed off the buildings before being replaced by an unnatural growling sound. Across the street, a school bus had crashed into a storefront, children's screams mixing with sounds that no human throat should make. Marcus grabbed his service weapon and radio, his training kicking in despite the surreal horror unfolding before him. "All units, this is Rodriguez. We have a citywide emergency. Multiple casualties, hostile civilians attacking randomly. Request immediate backup and medical assistance." The radio responded with static, then panicked voices from officers across the city reporting similar incidents. The infection, whatever it was spreading faster than wildfire. Jessica pulled Marcus toward the armory, her eyes wide with a plan forming. "We need to get to the roof, establish a safe zone, and figure out what's happening." As they gathered weapons and ammunition, the building shook with the impact of bodies slamming against the reinforced doors. Through the security monitors, Marcus counted at least 30 infected individuals surrounding the precinct, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes clouded with a milky film that made them look already dead. The infected showed no signs of pain or fatigue, continuing to assault the building even as their hands bled from clawing at concrete and steel. One figure caught Marcus's attention: Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who brought cookies to the station every Christmas, now stumbling with the same predatory hunger as the others, her floral dress torn and stained with blood that wasn't her own. The two officers made their way to the roof, where the scope of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. Smoke billowed from dozens of locations across Phoenix, emergency sirens wailed in a cacophony of chaos, and the interstate was clogged with abandoned vehicles as far as the eye could see. Marcus spotted movement in the distance, a group of survivors on a neighboring rooftop, waving desperately for help. Among them, he could make out a woman holding what appeared to be a small child, their silent pleas for rescue cutting through his professional detachment. "We have to help them," Jessica said, but even as she spoke, they watched the building's door burst open, releasing a flood of infected that quickly overwhelmed the survivors. The woman's scream carried across the distance before being abruptly silenced. As the sun began to set on what might be civilization's last day, Marcus and Jessica realized they were completely cut off from the outside world. Radio communications had devolved into desperate final transmissions from fellow officers before cutting to static. The military emergency broadcast repeated every 15 minutes, but offered no hope of rescue, only warnings to shelter in place and avoid the infected at all costs. From their vantage point, they could see that the infection had spread beyond the city limits, with distant explosions suggesting that even military intervention was failing. The infected moved in growing hordes, their numbers swelling with each person they caught, creating an unstoppable wave of destruction that consumed everything in its path. Marcus checked his ammunition, enough for maybe 50 shots, and looked at Jessica, who was already rationing their water supply. They both understood the terrible mathematics of their situation. In a world where every human could become the enemy, survival wasn't just about fighting the infected, it was about maintaining their own humanity while the world collapsed around them. The zombie apocalypse had begun, and Phoenix was ground zero for humanity's last stand. Dawn broke over Phoenix like a blood-red omen, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of crimson that matched the chaos below. Marcus Rodriguez had barely slept, keeping watch as Jessica Thompson worked frantically with the police radio, trying to establish contact with anyone who might still be alive. The infected had spent the entire night clawing at the precinct's reinforced doors, their relentless scratching creating a soundtrack of horror that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life, however long that might be. As the morning light revealed the full extent of the devastation, both officers realized that staying put was no longer an option. Their food would last maybe 3 days, and the infected showed no signs of losing interest in their location. The breakthrough came at 7:23 a.m. when Jessica's radio crackled to life with a clear, desperate voice. "This is Captain William Hayes, Arizona National Guard, broadcasting from Luke Air Force Base. Any survivors in the Phoenix metropolitan area? We are establishing a safe zone perimeter. Military evacuation available for civilians who can reach Checkpoint Alpha at the intersection of Indian School Road and 19th Avenue." Marcus felt a surge of hope until he realized the brutal reality. That checkpoint was 12 miles away through a city now overrun with infected. Jessica plotted their route on a Phoenix street map, her finger tracing potential paths while avoiding major roads that were surely clogged with abandoned vehicles and roaming hordes. "We could take the canal system," she suggested, pointing to the network of waterways that ran through the city. "Less likely to encounter large groups, and we can move faster on foot along the maintenance roads." Their planning was interrupted by a new sound from below, human voices, but not the mindless groans of the infected. Marcus peered through the security monitors to see 3 survivors huddled behind an overturned police cruiser in the parking lot. A middle-aged man in mechanic's coveralls, a young woman clutching a backpack, and an elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick. The infected hadn't noticed them yet, but it was only a matter of time. "We have to get them inside," Jessica said, but Marcus shook his head grimly. "The moment we open those doors, every infected in a 3-block radius will hear it. We'll be overrun in seconds." The moral weight of watching fellow survivors die while staying safe pressed down on both officers like a physical force. The solution came from an unexpected source, the building's fire escape system. Marcus remembered that the precinct had been retrofitted with an external emergency ladder that extended to the parking lot, originally designed for prisoner transfers during emergencies. If they could time it perfectly, they might be able to extract the survivors without compromising their position. Jessica found bolt cutters in the maintenance room while Marcus gathered rope and their remaining ammunition. The plan was dangerous but simple. Lower the ladder, get the survivors up, and hope the infected were too focused on the building's main entrance to notice the activity on the side wall. As they prepared for the rescue attempt, Marcus made contact with the survivors below using hand signals through the window. The mechanic, who appeared to be their leader, showed understanding and began quietly organizing his group for a rapid climb. Through gestures, he communicated that the young woman was injured. Marcus could see blood seeping through her jeans from what looked like a bite mark on her leg. The implications sent ice through his veins, but there was no time to consider whether they were about to invite infection into their safe haven. The elderly man looked exhausted, barely able to stand, and Marcus wondered if he'd have the strength to climb 3 stories before the infected noticed the commotion. The rescue began at exactly 8:15 a.m. Marcus lowered the ladder while Jessica provided overwatch with her service weapon, scanning for any infected that might approach their position. The young woman went first, moving slowly but steadily despite her injury, her teeth gritted against obvious pain. The mechanic helped boost the elderly man, who climbed with surprising determination fueled by desperation. Just as the mechanic began his own ascent, a group of infected rounded the corner of the building, drawn by the metallic scraping of the ladder against the wall. Jessica's first shot echoed across the parking lot like a dinner bell, and suddenly infected poured from every direction, converging on their position with terrifying speed. "Move, move, move," Marcus shouted as he hauled the elderly man through the roof access door. Jessica laid down covering fire while the mechanic scrambled up the ladder with infected hands grasping at his boots. One grabbed his ankle, and for a heart-stopping moment, it looked like he would be pulled down into the growing horde below. The young woman, despite her injury, grabbed a pipe wrench from her backpack and brought it down hard on the infected skull, the impact making a wet cracking sound that would echo in Marcus's nightmares. With all survivors safely on the roof, they pulled up the ladder just as dozens of infected slammed into the wall below, their frustrated shrieks filling the air. The immediate danger had passed, but their presence was no longer secret. And worse, they now had 4 mouths to feed instead of 2, with one potentially infected member among them. The makeshift group of survivors huddled on the precinct rooftop as Marcus Rodriguez quickly assessed their new companions. The mechanic introduced himself as Tommy Brennan, his calloused hands still gripping a tire iron stained with dark blood. The elderly man, Professor Eugene Miller, had been a biology teacher at Phoenix Community College before the world ended, and his sharp eyes held an intelligence that might prove valuable. The injured woman, Ashley Martinez, sat quietly examining her leg wound, her face pale but determined. Marcus noticed she kept checking her watch obsessively, as if timing something, which sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. Jessica Thompson had pulled him aside earlier, whispering her concerns about the bite mark on Ashley's leg, but with infected surrounding the building below, they had little choice but to trust their new allies and hope for the best. Their escape plan took shape as the morning sun climbed higher, baking the concrete rooftop and filling the air with the stench of smoke and decay from the city below. Tommy had intimate knowledge of Phoenix's underground utility systems from his years working for the city's water department, and he sketched a route through storm drains and maintenance tunnels that could get them within 2 blocks of the military checkpoint. Professor Miller contributed crucial observations about the infected's behavior patterns. They seemed to respond more to sound than sight, moved sluggishly in large groups, but became terrifyingly fast when pursuing individual targets. Ashley remained mostly silent, but when she spoke, her questions were sharp and tactical. Ammunition counts, escape routes, contingency plans. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that she was preparing for something the rest of them weren't considering. The descent into the storm drain system began at noon, when the infected below had dispersed somewhat in search of other prey. Tommy led them through a maintenance access hidden behind the precinct's dumpsters, the heavy steel grate opening onto a concrete tunnel that stretched into darkness. The smell hit them immediately, a mixture of stagnant water, decay, and something else that made Marcus's stomach churn. Their flashlights revealed a tunnel system larger than expected, with multiple branching passages that could easily become a maze for the unprepared. Professor Miller noted scratch marks on the concrete walls, too deliberate to be random, suggesting that some infected had found their way underground. The group moved in single file, Jessica bringing up the rear with her weapon drawn, everyone hyper-aware that their flashlight beams might attract exactly the kind of attention they were trying to avoid. 3 hours into their underground journey, they encountered their first infected in the tunnels. The creature had once been a maintenance worker, still wearing a city utility vest, but now its fingers had been worn to bone from clawing at concrete walls. It moved with the jerky, predatory gait they'd observed from above, but in the confined space of the tunnel, it seemed even more terrifying. Tommy dispatched it quietly with his tire iron, the wet impact echoing through the tunnels in a way that made everyone freeze and listen for approaching footsteps. Ashley's breathing had become labored, and when Marcus checked her wound during a brief rest stop, he noticed red streaks radiating from the bite mark, classic signs of serious infection, though whether bacterial or something worse, he couldn't determine. She caught him looking and gave him a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I know what you're thinking," she whispered. "Just promise me that when the time comes, you'll make it quick." The tunnel system proved more dangerous than expected when they encountered a section that had partially collapsed, forcing them to surface near a shopping mall that had become a congregation point for hundreds of infected. Through storm grates, they could see the parking lot filled with shambling figures, all moving with the same purposeless wandering that characterized the infected during daylight hours. Professor Miller made a disturbing observation. The infected seemed to be gathering in larger groups as time passed, almost as if they were developing some form of pack behavior. Tommy found an alternate route through the mall's underground service corridors, but it meant traveling directly beneath the infected horde, hearing their footsteps and groans through the thin ceiling above their heads. Ashley's condition deteriorated rapidly as they navigated the service tunnels. Her fever spiked, and she began experiencing hallucinations, talking to people who weren't there and becoming increasingly agitated. When she suddenly lunged at Professor Miller with a piece of broken pipe, Jessica was forced to restrain her while Marcus made the terrible decision that none of them wanted to face. Ashley's final moments were lucid, and she thanked them for trying to save her before the infection took her completely. They left her body in a sealed maintenance room, but not before she pressed a small notebook into Marcus's hands, containing detailed observations about the infected's behavior and what appeared to be government facility locations marked throughout Arizona. Her sacrifice had given them valuable intelligence, but at a cost that weighed heavily on everyone's conscience as they emerged from the tunnels just 6 blocks from the military checkpoint, only to discover that the supposed safe zone was under siege by thousands of infected, with no signs of military presence anywhere. The sight of the overrun military checkpoint crushed what remained of the group's hope, but Tommy Brennan quickly rallied them with knowledge of a nearby warehouse district where his brother-in-law had operated a survival supply business. "Danny always said he built that place to withstand anything," Tommy explained as they crouched behind abandoned cars, watching hundreds of infected wandering through what should have been their salvation. The warehouse was only 8 blocks away, and with Ashley's notebook revealing potential government safe houses scattered across Arizona, they needed supplies and a secure base to plan their next move. Professor Miller studied the infected's movement patterns around the checkpoint, noting that they seemed to be following some kind of routine, almost like guard duty, which suggested their behavior was evolving in ways that made them even more dangerous. The journey to the warehouse took them through Phoenix's industrial district, where massive buildings provided cover but also created echo chambers that amplified every sound. Marcus Rodriguez led the group with newfound caution, Ashley's death weighing heavily on his conscience and making him hyper-aware of every decision's potential consequences. Jessica Thompson had grown increasingly quiet since the tunnel incident, her usual optimism replaced by a grim determination that worried Marcus more than outright despair. When they finally reached the warehouse complex, Tommy's face lit up at the sight of reinforced steel doors and intact windows, until they noticed smoke rising from a chimney and heard voices coming from inside. Someone else had claimed Danny's survival fortress, and from the harsh laughter echoing through the walls, they didn't sound like the kind of neighbors anyone would want. Tommy insisted on approaching alone, claiming that his brother-in-law might still be alive inside, but Marcus overruled him with police instincts that had kept him alive this long. Instead, they conducted surveillance from a neighboring building, using binoculars to peer through the warehouse windows. What they saw made Marcus's blood run cold. A group of at least 12 survivors had indeed fortified the warehouse, but they'd also created a horrific scene inside. Bodies hung from meat hooks along one wall, and through the windows they could see people who were clearly prisoners being forced to work while armed guards watched them. Professor Miller identified the setup immediately. They're using other survivors as slave labor and food sources. We're looking at cannibals who've organized themselves into a functional society. The moral dilemma tore at the group's remaining unity. Tommy wanted to storm the building to save his brother-in-law, Jessica argued for finding another location entirely, and Professor Miller suggested they could potentially negotiate with the cannibals for supplies. Marcus found himself making increasingly difficult leadership decisions as he realized that in this new world, being human didn't automatically make someone an ally. The debate was cut short when one of the warehouse guards spotted their observation post and raised an alarm. Within minutes, armed figures emerged from the building, moving with military precision toward their location. These weren't desperate survivors. They were organized predators who had adapted to the apocalypse by preying on other humans, and they clearly viewed Marcus's group as their next victims. The chase through the industrial district became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the cannibal group demonstrating disturbing knowledge of the infected's behavior patterns. They used noisemakers to drive infected toward Marcus's group while staying safely out of range themselves, forcing the survivors to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. During one terrifying sequence, Jessica became separated from the group when a pack of infected cut off their escape route, and Marcus had to choose between pursuing the cannibals who had taken Tommy prisoner or searching for his partner. Professor Miller made the choice for him, grabbing Marcus's arm and pointing toward a building where Jessica's muzzle flashes could be seen through windows. She was alive but trapped on an upper floor with infected swarming the stairwells below. The rescue operation revealed just how far civilization had fallen in less than a week. Marcus and Professor Miller fought their way through infected-filled corridors to reach Jessica, only to discover she'd been holding position to protect a group of warehouse prisoners who had escaped during the chaos. Among them was Tommy's brother-in-law Danny, barely alive after days of captivity, who revealed that the cannibal group had been systematically hunting survivor groups throughout Phoenix, using radio communications to lure them into traps. The warehouse had been a setup from the beginning, the smoke and voices deliberately designed to attract desperate survivors. Tommy had been taken as bait to draw the rest of the group back for capture, and Danny warned that the cannibals had contacts throughout the city who provided information about survivor movements in exchange for protection. As night fell over Phoenix, Marcus realized their situation had become exponentially more dangerous. Not only were they fighting infected and dwindling supplies, but they now faced organized human predators who knew the city better than they did. Danny's information about the cannibal network suggested that most of the supposed safe houses marked in Ashley's notebook might be compromised, leaving them with few options for shelter. The group had grown to include the rescued prisoners, but they were injured, traumatized, and had no supplies beyond what they could carry. With Tommy captured and possibly already dead, Jessica struggling with guilt over the separated chase, and infected drawn to their location by the recent gunfire, Marcus faced the hardest decision yet. Risk everything in a rescue attempt for Tommy, or abandon him to save the others and find a way out of Phoenix before the cannibal network closed in around them completely. The decision to abandon Tommy Brennan haunted Marcus Rodriguez as he led the expanded group of survivors through Phoenix's labyrinthine storm drain system, but Danny's weakened voice kept repeating the same grim truth: Tommy's already dead, or he will be soon. Those animals don't keep prisoners long. The rescued captives included a nurse named Rebecca Foster who immediately began treating the group's injuries, a teenage boy called Kevin who hadn't spoken since his rescue, and an elderly woman named Dorothy Chin whose sharp mind had helped her survive the warehouse nightmare through pure cunning. Jessica Thompson took point navigation using city maintenance maps they'd found in Danny's survival supplies, but the underground passages seemed different now, darker, more threatening, with sounds echoing from depths that suggested they weren't the only ones who discovered the tunnel network's protective value. 3 hours into their underground journey, Professor Miller made a disturbing discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about the infected. While examining scratch marks on the tunnel walls, he noticed they formed deliberate patterns, not random clawing, but purposeful markings that seemed to indicate direction and territory. "These aren't mindless monsters," he whispered to Marcus, his voice tight with fear. "They're adapting, learning, possibly even communicating." The implications hit the group like a physical blow. If the infected were developing intelligence or pack coordination, every survival strategy they developed became obsolete overnight. Rebecca confirmed Miller's fears when she shared her medical observations from the warehouse. The infected she'd seen showed varying stages of decay, suggesting some retained more cognitive function than others, creating a horrifying hierarchy within the Horde. The tunnel system proved to be a maze of competing dangers when they encountered their first evidence of infected adaptation. In a large junction chamber, they discovered what could only be described as a nest. Dozens of human remains arranged in organized piles, with fresher kills positioned near tunnel entrances like some grotesque early warning system. The infected hadn't just wandered into the tunnels, they'd claimed territory and established hunting grounds. Kevin, the silent teenager, suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm and pointed toward shadows moving in the deeper passages. What approached them wasn't the shambling horde they'd expected, but a coordinated group of infected that moved with purpose, using hand signals and positioning themselves to cut off escape routes. These weren't the mindless creatures from the surface. They were predators who had retained enough intelligence to hunt strategically. The fight in the tunnels became a nightmare of close-quarters combat in near-total darkness. Jessica's flashlight revealed infected that had adapted to underground life, their eyes reflecting light like nocturnal animals, their movements silent and coordinated. Danny, despite his injuries, proved invaluable with his knowledge of tunnel layouts, guiding them through maintenance shafts and emergency exits that the infected hadn't yet discovered. During the running battle, Dorothy showed surprising resourcefulness, using her knowledge of chemistry to create improvised explosive devices from cleaning supplies found in maintenance rooms. The explosions not only cleared their immediate path but also collapsed several tunnel sections, buying them precious time while potentially trapping other infected deeper in the system. Rebecca's medical training became crucial when Kevin suffered a severe injury during their escape, taking a deep gash across his ribs from infected claws that had been sharpened on concrete walls. As she worked to stop the bleeding in a sealed maintenance chamber, she made another chilling discovery. Kevin's wound showed signs of a toxin that wasn't present in surface infected attacks. The underground infected had somehow developed enhanced abilities, possibly through exposure to chemicals in the storm drain system or evolution driven by their subterranean environment. Professor Miller theorized that the constant darkness and confined spaces had accelerated their adaptation, creating a subspecies that was more dangerous than anything they'd encountered above ground. Their underground journey led to an unexpected discovery when Danny's knowledge of city infrastructure brought them to a forgotten Cold War bunker beneath the Phoenix Federal Building. Hidden behind a maintenance door that required both Danny's access codes and Dorothy's lockpicking skills, the bunker contained government documents that made Ashley's notebook look like amateur intelligence gathering. The files revealed that the infection hadn't been accidental. It was the result of military biological weapons testing that had gone catastrophically wrong. More importantly, the documents included detailed maps of underground government facilities throughout the Southwest, including a major research installation called Project Haven located beneath Luke Air Force Base, where scientists had supposedly been working on a cure before communication was lost. As the group studied the classified documents by flashlight, Jessica made a discovery that changed their entire mission. Among the files was a personnel roster for Project Haven that included her sister Amanda, a CDC virologist who had been seconded to the military research team just weeks before the outbreak began. The installation's automated systems were still broadcasting a low-frequency emergency signal that suggested at least some of the facility remained operational. Marcus faced another impossible decision. The underground route to Luke Air Force Base would take them directly through territory now controlled by evolved infected, but the facility might contain both a cure for the infection and Jessica's only surviving family member. The bunker's communication equipment crackled to life with a weak transmission from the base. Day 6 post-outbreak. Project Haven secure. Limited survivors. Need immediate extraction. Cure development at 70% completion. The message repeated every hour, a beacon of hope in a world that had offered nothing but death and betrayal, but reaching it would require them to descend even deeper into the infected's underground domain. The journey to Luke Air Force Base through the underground network took 18 grueling hours, with the group moving in shifts while others stood guard against the evolved infected that seemed to track their every movement through the tunnel system. Marcus Rodriguez had never imagined that reaching a military installation would feel like approaching a tomb, but the silence emanating from the base's underground access points suggested something had gone terribly wrong with Project Haven. Danny's knowledge of government infrastructure proved invaluable as he guided them through maintenance tunnels that connected to the base's underground facilities, but even his confident demeanor faltered when they discovered the first bodies, military personnel in hazmat suits who had clearly died fighting something far worse than standard infected. Jessica Thompson's anxiety about her sister Amanda grew with each step, especially when they found CDC identification badges scattered among the carnage, their photos showing faces that would never smile again. The Project Haven facility stretched far deeper underground than any of them had anticipated, with multiple levels connected by emergency stairwells that descended into darkness like a concrete version of Dante's Inferno. Professor Miller noted that the facility's design suggested it had been built for long-term isolation research, with airlocks, decontamination chambers, and blast doors that could seal entire sections in case of containment failure. Rebecca Foster's medical training helped her interpret the biohazard warnings posted throughout the facility, and her face grew increasingly pale as she realized the scope of the experiments that had been conducted here. The automated systems were indeed still functioning, but their recorded messages painted a picture of scientific hubris gone catastrophically wrong. Day 3 post-outbreak. Containment breach in Level 7. Test subjects showing unprecedented adaptive capabilities. Requesting immediate evacuation authorization. The first signs of what Project Haven had become appeared on Level 4, where they discovered laboratory equipment that had been twisted and destroyed from the inside out, as if something incredibly strong had systematically dismantled every piece of scientific apparatus with deliberate intelligence. Kevin, who had remained mostly silent since the warehouse rescue, suddenly spoke for the first time in days. They learned, he whispered, his young voice carrying a weight of trauma that made everyone stop and listen. The infected down here, they figured out what the scientists were doing to them and they fought back. Dorothy Chen's sharp eyes caught details that others missed, scratch marks on metal doors that formed recognizable patterns, laboratory computers that had been operated rather than destroyed, and most chilling of all, security footage that showed infected working together to open electronic locks. The discovery of Dr. Amanda Thompson came in the facility's main laboratory, where Jessica found her sister barricaded behind reinforced glass with a small group of surviving scientists and military personnel. The reunion was bittersweet. Amanda was alive but clearly traumatized, and her first words to Jessica were a warning: "Don't let them know you're here. The infected down here aren't like the ones on the surface. They remember who hurt them and they're patient enough to plan revenge." Through the laboratory's intercom system, Amanda explained that the cure development had progressed to 85% completion before the facility was overrun by test subjects who had retained enough intelligence to coordinate a systematic rebellion against their captors. The cure existed, but it was stored in Level 8, the deepest part of the facility, which had been sealed and was now controlled by what Amanda described as Patient Zero variants, infected who had been exposed to experimental treatments that enhanced rather than cured their condition. The military personnel trapped with Amanda included Colonel Jack Morrison, the base commander who revealed the full scope of the government's response plan. Nuclear strikes were indeed being prepared for all major infected zones, scheduled to commence in 72 hours, but Luke Air Force Base was at the center of the target zone. The cure samples needed to be extracted and transmitted to other government facilities before the bombing began, or humanity's only hope for defeating the infection would be vaporized along with everything else in Arizona. Morrison had maintained sporadic radio contact with other military installations, and the reports were universally grim. Infected populations were growing exponentially, showing increased organization and intelligence in every location, and conventional military tactics were proving useless against enemies who learned from each engagement. The rescue plan that emerged from their desperate brainstorming session required splitting the group in ways that violated every survival instinct Marcus had developed. Half the team would create a diversion on the upper levels to draw the evolved infected away from level 8, while the others attempted to reach the cure samples and activate the facility's emergency transmission system. Jessica volunteered for the most dangerous assignment, penetrating level 8 with Amanda, whose knowledge of the facility layout was essential for navigating the most heavily defended area. Marcus found himself facing the hardest decision of the entire apocalypse, allowing Jessica to risk her life for a cure that might not work, or keeping the group together and abandoning humanity's last hope. The choice became even more terrible when Amanda revealed that the Patient Zero variants weren't just intelligent. They were communicating with infected populations across the entire Southwest, coordinating a response to the planned nuclear strikes that suggested they understood exactly what the government intended to do. Time was running out for both the survivors and the species, and the cure lay beyond defenses designed by the infected themselves, who had learned to think, plan, and hate with all the intelligence of their former human selves. The countdown to nuclear annihilation had reached 58 hours when Marcus Rodriguez made the decision that would haunt him forever. Splitting their group meant that some of them would die, but staying together guaranteed that everyone would perish when the bombs fell. Jessica Thompson and her sister Amanda descended toward level 8 with Professor Miller and Kevin, carrying the technical knowledge needed to extract and transmit the cure, while Marcus led the diversion team consisting of Rebecca Foster, Dorothy Chin, Danny, and Colonel Morrison toward the upper levels where they would attempt to draw the evolved infected away from the cure storage area. The plan was desperate, relying on the hope that the Patient Zero variants retained enough human psychology to be provoked into abandoning their strategic positions in favor of pursuing immediate threats. But as Marcus watched Jessica disappear into the darkness of the lower facility, he wondered if he was sending her to her death for a cure that might already be compromised. The diversion began with controlled explosions on level 3, where Dorothy's chemistry knowledge proved invaluable in creating devices that would generate maximum noise while minimizing structural damage to the facility's crucial systems. The response from the evolved infected was immediate and terrifying. They didn't come running mindlessly toward the explosions, but instead began systematic movements that suggested they understood exactly what the survivors were attempting. Through the facility's security monitors, Marcus watched as infected coordinated their response, with some moving to investigate the disturbances while others remained positioned to guard the lower levels. Colonel Morrison's military experience became crucial as he recognized the infected's tactics as sophisticated infantry maneuvers, complete with flanking movements and coordinated communication through sounds that resembled a twisted version of military hand signals translated into groans and clicks. Jessica's team faced horrors beyond imagination as they descended through level 8 security checkpoints, where Amanda's access code still functioned but triggered automated warnings about extreme biological hazards and cognitive enhancement protocols. The cure storage area was guarded not just by evolved infected, but by something that made Professor Miller's scientific mind real. The Patient Zero variants had created a primitive but effective technological interface, using their enhanced intelligence to operate laboratory equipment and even modify security systems to their advantage. Kevin's youth proved surprisingly valuable when he recognized that the infected were using video game logic to defend their territory, positioning themselves like players who understood respawn points, choke points, and strategic resource control. Amanda guided them through maintenance shafts that bypassed the main corridors, but the Patient Zero variants had anticipated this approach and laid traps that demonstrated planning abilities that rivaled military strategists. The diversion team's battle on the upper levels became a desperate running fight through corridors filled with infected who retained enough military training to use weapons and tactics effectively. Rebecca discovered that some of the infected soldiers still wore their dog tags and responded to their former names, creating heartbreaking moments where humanity flickered briefly in their eyes before being overwhelmed by predatory hunger. Marcus found himself fighting former police officers who recognized his uniform and seemed to take personal offense at his presence, as if they retained memories of their previous lives but interpreted them through the lens of their infected consciousness. Danny's knowledge of the facility's layout allowed the diversion team to stay ahead of their pursuers, but Marcus realized they were being herded rather than chased. The evolved infected were guiding them toward specific locations for reasons that became terrifyingly clear when they triggered a containment lockdown that sealed them into a section with no obvious exits. Jessica's team reached the cure storage just as the nuclear countdown entered its final 24 hours, But Amanda's face went white when she accessed the laboratory computers and discovered that the cure samples had been deliberately contaminated by the patient zero variants. The evolved infected hadn't just learned to operate equipment. They had learned to sabotage it, understanding that destroying the cure would prevent humanity from developing defenses against their kind. However, Professor Miller's expertise revealed a backup protocol that Amanda hadn't known about. The cure formula was stored in the facility's quantum computer system, which could transmit the complete genetic sequence to other research facilities if they could reach the communication array on level 1. The catch was that accessing the quantum system required manual input from multiple terminals simultaneously, meaning Jessica's team would have to split up even further while moving through territory controlled by the most intelligent and dangerous infected in the facility. The race became a nightmare of parallel action as both teams fought desperately against time and enemies who seemed to anticipate their every move. Marcus's diversion team discovered that their containment wasn't accidental. The evolved infected had been studying human behavior and had set up the entire scenario to capture live subjects for experimentation, suggesting they were developing their own research protocols to understand and counter human tactics. Jessica found herself separated from Amanda during a coordinated infected attack that demonstrated battlefield intelligence, leaving her alone in the quantum computer chamber with Kevin while Amanda and Professor Miller fought their way toward the transmission array through corridors filled with patient zero variants who seemed to recognize Amanda specifically and pursued her with what could only be described as personal vendetta. With 18 hours until nuclear impact, the cure transmission beginning, and both teams scattered throughout a facility controlled by evolved infected who understood exactly what they were trying to prevent, Marcus realized that even if they succeeded in transmitting the cure, survival would require escaping an underground complex that had become a monument to humanity's greatest mistake, creating enemies who could think, plan, and hate with all the intelligence of their former selves. The quantum transmission succeeded with only 47 minutes remaining before nuclear impact, as Jessica Thompson and Kevin managed to upload the complete cure formula to research facilities across North America while Amanda and Professor Miller fought their way to the surface transmission array through hordes of patient zero variants who seemed to understand that humanity's last hope was slipping through their clawed fingers. Marcus Rodriguez's diversion team had broken free from their containment trap through Dorothy Chen's improvised explosives, but the cost was devastating. Rebecca Foster had been overwhelmed while providing covering fire, and Danny had sacrificed himself to seal a corridor filled with evolved infected, his final words echoing through Marcus's radio, "Tell my brother I tried to make it right." The facility shook with the impact of the nuclear countdown's final preparations, automated systems announcing evacuation protocols that no one could follow while Patient Zero variants coordinated final desperate attacks to prevent the survivors from reaching the surface. The emergence from Project Haven came with only 12 minutes to spare, as the survivors burst through emergency exits into the Arizona desert just as the first flash appeared on the horizon, not from Luke Air Force Base, but from Phoenix itself, where the military had begun their systematic destruction of infected population centers. Marcus watched the mushroom cloud rise over what had been his city, his home, his entire world, knowing that millions of infected and possibly thousands of surviving humans had been vaporized in an instant. Jessica held Amanda close as they witnessed the end of the world they had known, but also the beginning of something that might be hope. Radio transmissions were already confirming that research facilities in Denver, Atlanta, and Seattle had received the cure data and were beginning production of what Amanda believed could be an airborne vaccine capable of stopping the infection spread. The nuclear blast's electromagnetic pulse had disabled most electronic equipment within a 100-mile radius, but Colonel Morrison's military radio, hardened against such effects, crackled with reports that painted a complex picture of humanity's situation. The coordinated nuclear strikes had successfully eliminated major infected populations in urban centers, but rural areas remained largely untouched, and the evolved infected had demonstrated an ability to adapt and retreat that suggested they had anticipated the government's response. More disturbing were reports from military units that some infected had actually evacuated population centers before the bombings, almost as if they had developed their own intelligence networks capable of predicting human strategy. The cure transmission had been successful, but distributing and implementing it would require infrastructure that had just been destroyed across most of the continental United States. 3 weeks after the nuclear dawn, the small group of survivors had established a settlement in the ruins of a small Arizona town called Harmony Springs, chosen for its distance from both blast zones and known infected populations. Other survivors had found them, families who had hidden in basements and bunkers, military personnel from scattered units, and even a few individuals who claimed to be immune to the infection entirely. Jessica had taken charge of organizing the medical response using her sister Amanda's expertise, while Marcus found himself reluctantly accepting leadership of what was becoming a genuine community of nearly 200 people. The cure had been successfully deployed in several major cities, with reports indicating that new infections had dropped to zero in treated areas, but the logistics of reaching every survivor group remained overwhelming. The evolved infected hadn't disappeared with the nuclear strikes. They had simply changed tactics again, operating now in smaller, more intelligent groups that avoided direct confrontation while systematically hunting isolated survivor communities. Kevin, now showing remarkable maturity for his age, had become the settlement's early warning specialist, using skills learned in the underground facilities to detect signs of infected scouting parties. Dorothy continued her chemistry work, developing better defenses and communication methods, while Professor Miller established a school to ensure that children born into this new world would understand both the scientific knowledge needed to maintain the cure and the tactical awareness required to survive contact with evolved infected who grew more sophisticated with each passing month. Marcus stood on the settlement's observation tower 6 months after the nuclear dawn, watching convoys arrive with supplies and news from the slowly recovering outside world. The cure had proven effective, new infections were rare, and humanity was learning to rebuild in a world where the rules had fundamentally changed. Yet the radio reports also brought troubling news. The evolved infected were establishing their own territories in the uninhabitable zones between surviving human settlements, creating a world divided between islands of cured humanity and infected regions where intelligence and predatory hunger had merged into something that might eventually challenge human dominance entirely. Jessica joined him on the tower, her hand finding his as they watched the sun set over their small piece of recovered world. "We survived," she said simply, but Marcus heard the unspoken truth in her voice. They had survived the zombie apocalypse, but they had inherited a world where the war between thinking humans and thinking infected had only just begun. The settlement of Harmony Springs represented hope, community, and the possibility that humanity could adapt and endure, but beyond the horizon lay territories where evolution had taken a different path, and where the future would be decided by which species could learn, grow, and change faster than the other. The new dawn had arrived, but it illuminated a world where survival meant accepting that humanity was no longer alone at the top of the evolutionary ladder. Chat controls Sonnet 4.